going to discuss the Great Molasses Flood, one of America's largest but most forgotten tragedies.
Over 21 people died and 150 were injured. But to understand why this terrible tragedy occurred, we have to go back to 1915.
The Purity Distilling Company, a United States industrial alcohol subsidiary, first filled its tank with molasses in 1915. The USIA cut as many corners as they could to fill this dang tank.
They ignored the creaking and groaning that came from within the tank, painting it brown to cover up the molasses leaking from it on a daily basis. The tank did not meet the already minute safety standards at the time. The walls were too thin, as the steel used to make them contained too little manganese. Further, the rivets holding the tank together were faulty in both design and material.
Back to 1919, just a few days before the tank exploded, warm molasses was put into it. When it burst, the liquid had a lower viscosity as it floated out of the tank.
The wave was reported to be more than 25 feet tall and traveling at more than 35 miles per hour.
As the molasses moved through the streets, the cold Boston winter started to cool down the viscous molasses, hardening it, trapping everything that was inside.
Animals and people were indistinguishable from one another under the hard layers of molasses as people tried to save those buried underneath.
The wave knocked down houses and pulled up train tracks as it moved through the streets. We're going to do a demonstration of what made the disaster so deadly. This ball dropped into the water is very easy for me to simply pull out, but if this was a pool of molasses, it would have been stuck.
There you go.
To demonstrate to you the powerful stickiness of molasses, we are now going on a mission to retrieve some.
Go.
I'll stand
We
in
got
the
our
background.
molasses.
It's crazy. It took us forever to find it.
Yeah, the shopper.
10 minutes.
Give me the book. That's it?
Yeah.
So this is our control. We see it's the pool water. You already know. See? Sits in there. Pretty easy to get out. A little wet. So but if we come over here to our area that we consider our flood zone. Pretty gross, right? And we put the ping pong ball that was in the molasses. It's harder to get out, and dang, that looks weird.
Further, after enough time in the hot sun, the molasses is going to harden, which would permanently trap the ping pong ball inside.
show the viscosity in colder temperatures, we put some ice in there, if anybody wants to like move it. Yeah. Look how much slower that goes in, well, what it would have been in water. Crazy.
The Great Molasses Flood led to one of the first class action lawsuits in American history, with many families of many of the victims coming together to sue the Purity Distilling Company.
While the company claimed that the tank had been sabotaged by anarchists and radical communists, the truth was that they had been negligent in building the tank. The lawsuit was able to expose that and win a significant amount of money for the victims of the tragedy.
The Purity Distilling Company was found to be at fault for keeping the tank at unsafe conditions, letting it leak, croak, and even adding alcohol into the bases of the molasses, which potentially caused it to explode.
With United States Industrial Alcohol found guilty of not taking care of their tank, many new safety regulations were put in place to ensure that nothing like the Great Molasses Flood ever happened again.
While the Great Molasses Flood resulted in a reprehensible loss of human life, the overall outcomes from the tragedy were in fact positive. The victims' families received financial compensation from the company, the first such example of this happening. Further, new regulations were passed to regulate construction and other things that the company had neglected.
Okay. This set the precedent for class action lawsuits later down the line. One big instance of this, more recently, was the Theranos lawsuit,
Which the precedent set by the Purity Distilling Company paying out compensation to the families of the victims can be seen in modern day, in which Theranos is being sued by a number of people who utilized it. These people utilized Theranos in order to get tests for conditions or to get diagnosed for conditions that could be life-altering. And Elizabeth Holmes falsely reported these test results, reported that these tests worked when they did not. This led a number of people to have their lives turned upside down by false diagnoses of cancer or rare diseases, all sorts of bad things. They were forced to change their lifestyles, maybe even say goodbye to their families. And for this reason, they're likely to win similar financial compensation.
Let's go.
Yeah.
Oh. No.
Oh.
No. Yeah.
Oh.
And this is the torment. This is the torment that the people imagine drowning in that stuff. Imagine drowning in
Why did we have 2.3 billion gallons of
barely-
this?
He could barely swallow a spoonful, and people
I
were
need to-
choking to death
Holy-
on this stuff. Choking to death.
I'm gonna go throw up.
Tragic.
As one of the forgotten tragedies of Boston, the Great Molasses Flood was important due to the overall impacts that it left on American society. It exposed the way in which corporations would choose profit over safety, leading to an early example of corporate litigation and bringing about an introduction of early safety requirements for construction.
The lives lost in the Great Molasses Flood were irreplaceable, but they are honored through the changes to American policy and regulations that still help to keep people safe today.